The water in the scouring tub lies cloudy and warm around your wrists as the 1880s Hobart wool scourer bends over another basket of raw fleece in a shed that smells of sheep grease, damp timber, wood smoke, and slow Tasmanian rain. There is no hurry here, only the steady work of rinsing, lifting, waiting, and letting the room settle around you. The morning is not properly brightened yet, and outside the walls the harbour air is cool, while inside the scouring room the steam gathers on rafters blackened by soot and age. You can hear the town waking in pieces, not all at once, as Hobart stirs beyond the yard with hoofbeats on wet ground, cartwheels in ruts, and the low calls of men bringing bales from stores near the wharves. We are beside you in that half-light, close enough to notice the pale lanolin on your fingers, the rough edge of the wooden tub against your hip, and the way the wool clings to itself before the first wash loosens it. The 1880s Hobart wool scourer begins before most people have finished warming their hands, because fleece will not clean itself, and export wool must be made presentable before it can travel across oceans. The work is plain to look at, though it asks a great deal from the body, and that is part of why it sucked, in the old quiet sense of a job that wore a person down without ever making a grand story of it. There are no bright machines here to make the day feel modern, only tubs, baskets, paddles, boilers, drying racks, and water that must be heated, dirtied, drained, and heated again. You stand where the floorboards are damp from yesterday and the day before, and the smell of raw fleece rises thickly, not foul exactly, but animal, close, stubborn, and impossible to forget. The wool comes in pressed and bundled, sometimes from runs far beyond the town, sometimes marked with dust from long roads and burrs from scrubby paddocks. When a bale is opened, it seems to breathe out its own weather, carrying dry grass, sheep sweat, earth, and the faint mineral scent of country rain that fell weeks before your hands ever touched it. You reach into it, and your fingers find what the eye misses. Little knots, bits of seed, hardened grease, and the occasional dark stain that must be worked free before the buyer sees it. In Hobart in the 1880s, wool was not just wool, but money, credit, freight, reputation, and the patient labor of many people hidden beneath one soft word. The sheep had been shorn by hands that knew the weight of shears. The fleece had been sorted by people who could read a staple at a glance. And now you, the scourer, were part of the quiet chain that made raw growth into something the market could accept. We linger here because this was the kind of work history often passes over quickly, as though clean wool appeared because commerce required it, rather than because wet sleeves and tired backs made it so. The first task is not washing, not quite, but preparing yourself for the wash, because the body must learn the room before the room lets you work. You take your place near the tub, feel the heat pressing against your face, and notice how the cold morning still rests on your shoulders where the steam has not reached. Your apron is already stiff in places from old grease and soap, and your boots grip poorly on the damp boards, so every movement becomes a little bargain between balance and fatigue. The water must be warm enough to soften the yolk, the greasy natural coating of the fleece, but not so fierce that it harms the fibers or fixes the dirt deeper. That balance is never written in a neat line for you, not in the way a later factory manual might explain it, because much of the knowledge lives in hands, noses, wrists, and the patient eye. You test the tub the way workers test many things, not as a gentleman scientist might, but by nearness, habit, and the small warning your skin gives when heat has gone too far. The scour itself is a slow persuasion. You do not attack the wool, because wool punishes roughness by felting, shrinking, matting, and becoming less useful than it was when it arrived. So you press, turn, draw, and lift, letting the water enter the fleece, letting soap or alkali loosen what the sheep's body and the paddock have left behind, and letting gravity help when your arms begin to complain. The tub clouds almost at once, and the pale water becomes yellow-brown, carrying away dust, sweat, and grease in a bloom that spreads like tea in a cup. There is a particular sound to it, soft and heavy, as wool moves underwater. It is not like washing cloth, and not like washing hands, but more like turning a sleeping animal that does not wish to wake. The fibers drag against one another with a muffled sigh. The paddle knocks lightly against the tub, and somewhere behind you a boiler ticks and settles. reminding us that warmth itself has to be tended. You breathe through the smell, and after a while it becomes part of the room, as ordinary as your own coat hanging on a peg. What made the work hard was not one great difficulty, but the repetition of many small ones, each returning before the last had fully left your body. The steam opened your pores, the damp crept into your cuffs, the grease found the cracks in your skin, and the weight of soaked fleece turned light-looking wool into something stubborn and muscular. You might begin the morning with careful movements, but by the second or third tub your shoulders know the pattern too well, and the muscles between your fingers start to ache from gripping what cannot be hurried. When you lift a bundle from the tub, it drains in long, warm ropes, and the water runs back with a patter that sounds almost gentle. But the weight is no gentle thing. Wet wool can surprise you because it looks airy, soft, and almost cloud-like when dry, then becomes dense and dragging once the water holds it. You lean your body back a little, find your footing, and carry the fleece toward the next stage, feeling the heat leave your sleeves as cooler air touches them. The floor is never fully dry. That is one of the small miseries of the Hobart wool scourer's day, and one of the facts no ledger bothers to record. Boards swell, puddles gather near the tubs, and stray locks of wool cling to boots until the whole room seems to have grown a pale, damp fur of its own. You learn where to step and where not to step, but even careful feet slide sometimes, and a sudden shift of weight can send pain through the back more sharply than any spoken complaint. Outside, the Derwent may be silver under low cloud, and Mount Wellington may carry a wash of cold light along its slopes. But inside the shed, the world has narrowed to water, fleece, heat, and time. We can imagine the contrast, because Hobart was both town and edge, a place of stores, ships, yards, paddocks, and weather coming down from hills that could make a morning feel older than it was. The wool scour belonged to that meeting place between rural animal life and imperial trade, between the sheep run and the ship's hold. By the time the first cleaned fleece is spread for drying, the morning has deepened, and the work changes from heavy washing to the slower care of air, fibre, and patience. You lay the wool out where warmth and movement can reach it, teasing it apart without tearing, giving the fibres room to loosen after their time in the tub. A clean fleece does not become truly ready at once because water must leave it carefully, and the day's weather has its own opinion about how quickly that may happen. On a damp Hobart day, drying can feel like waiting for a reluctant guest. The air holds moisture, the bald smell of rain, and even the sacks stacked nearby seem to keep a cool breath in their seams. You spread the wool and turn it, then return later and turn it again, watching for patches that remain heavy or dull, while the steam from the scouring tubs continues to drift across the room in soft veils. The work asks you to notice small changes, and it gives very little praise for noticing them. This is one reason the job was more exacting than it appeared. Anyone passing the open doorway might see only a worker with wet hands moving wool from one place to another and think it little more than washing. But you know there is judgment in every lift, because wool too greasy may disappoint the buyer, wool too harshly treated may lose value, and wool dried poorly may sour, stain, or sit badly in its pack. The Scourer is not merely making something clean. You are preserving worth without ever being allowed to forget cost. The tools are simple enough to name, and that simplicity gives them a kind of quiet dignity. There are wooden tubs darkened by use, iron hoops, draining boards, wicker or wooden baskets, long paddles smoothed by palms, hooks, racks, and boilers that keep the water near its working heat. Soap may be used, and alkalis as well, depending on the practice of the place, the quality of the fleece, and the habits passed down by older hands who had ruined enough wool in their time to become careful. A paddle in your hand has more character than it ought to have. Its handle is worn where fingers have held it season after season, and its blade carries nicks from tub edges and the small accidents of work done while tired. You use it not to beat the wool, but to move water through it, to press a floating mass below the surface, and to loosen dirt without making the fibers lock together. By mid-morning, the paddle feels less like a tool than an extension of the ache already forming in your arms. There is a rhythm to the room when several workers share the scouring. One person opens and sorts a batch, another tends the tub, another drains, another spreads, and another carries what has dried enough to be packed or moved onward. The sounds overlap in a low domestic industry. Water slopping, boots shifting, wood creaking, someone clearing his throat, someone laughing once and then falling quiet again. We stay with you because this rhythm is the real heart of the day. Not a grand machine, but people keeping pace with one another. The warmth can be comforting at first, especially in winter, when Hobart mornings cut through woolen coats and make fingers clumsy before the work begins. You come into the shed cold, and the first breath of steam seems almost kind. Then, slowly, kindness becomes heaviness, and the same warm air that loosened your hands begins to settle on your chest. Your shirt dampens beneath your apron, your hair sticks near your temples, and the line between sweat and steam no longer matters very much. There is also the matter of smell, which is hard to explain gently, though the job cannot be understood without it. Raw fleece carries lanolin, dung, sweat, dust, vegetable matter, and the old close warmth of the animal that grew it, and hot water lifts those scents into the air with particular force. Over time, you stop flinching from it, because workers cannot spend every day resisting the place where their wages are made. But the smell follows you home, in your cuffs, in your hair, and in the skin around your nails. You might eat your midday bread with those same hands, washed as well as water and time allow, and still the trace remains. Bread, cheese, tea, perhaps a little meat if the week has allowed it, all carry the room's memory when eaten near the yard. The tea tastes slightly smoky from the boiler fire or the kettle, and the bread grows damp if left too near the steam. You sit on a crate, or stand by a doorway letting cooler air touch your face, while your back slowly remembers that it has been bent for hours. And as the morning wears towards its middle, we follow the 1880s Hobart wool scourer from the first heavy tubs into the quieter, no less tiring work of keeping the whole process moving. The day does not divide itself cleanly. One batch is soaking while another drains, one lot dries while another waits. And every stage calls your name before you have quite finished with the last. You learn to think in overlapping circles, not straight lines, because clean wool is made by returning, checking, lifting, and returning again. The scouring room has its own weather, and you live inside it. Near the boiler, the heat gathers strongly, thick enough to make the air shimmer, while near the doorway, a draft touches wet sleeves and makes you aware of every cold thread in the cloth. The windows, if there are windows, fog and clear by turns, and the light through them appears softened, as though even daylight must pass through steam before it can enter your work. You feel the day not by a clock alone, but by how the room smells as the water dirties and is changed. Changing water is its own labour, and it is not elegant. Dirty liquor must be drained or baled away, and fresh water must be brought, heated, mixed, and watched, all while the floor grows wetter and the tubs seem never to empty at the right moment. If a drain is slow, the whole place waits on it with dull irritation. If a fire slackens, the tub cools. If a tub cools, the grease resists. If the grease resists, your hands and arms must do what heat should have done. That is one of the quiet injustices of old manual work. When a process fails, the body fills the gap. A blunt tool means harder pressure, a cold tub means more rubbing, a damp day means more turning, and a late cart means heavier lifting in less time. You do not always name these things as unfair because naming them would not change the wool waiting beside you, but you feel them accumulating inside the joints, like weather collecting in old timber. In 1880s Hobart, the wool trade was tied to ships, warehouses, merchants and distant buyers who might never imagine the scouring shed at all. They might speak of clips, grades, bales, prices, freight, and markets, while you knew the same trade by the colour of washwater and the soreness of wrists at dusk. There is a softness in the product and a roughness in the making, and that contrast follows us through the day. Fine wool may pass through coarse hands, and those hands may be invisible once the bale is marked and sent away. The fleece itself changes under your touch, and that change can be satisfying in a small, private way. At first, it is greasy and resistant, with locks clumped together and dirt hidden in the folds. After the wash, after rinsing, after careful handling, it opens into something lighter, brighter, and more willing to move with air. You can run your fingers through it and feel the difference, And perhaps that is one of the few rewards the work gives directly, a before and after held in the palm. But satisfaction does not erase the conditions. The day is long, wages are modest, and the labor is low in status compared with the merchants who profit from what the shed prepares. Your clothes dry badly, your hands crack in winter, and in summer the heat of the room becomes something you must endure rather than welcome. The work may not be dangerous in a dramatic way, but it is wearing, and many wearing things leave marks precisely because they repeat themselves, without spectacle. The hands of a wool scourer tell the story before the mouth does. Skin roughens from wet work, nails darken at the edges, and small cuts sting sharply when touched by soap, alkali, or hot water. Lanolin softens some parts and grime hardens others, making the hands look older than the face. You learn to keep moving even when a knuckle throbs, because stopping for every small hurt would make the day impossible, and old workplaces often ask silence where comfort would have been kinder. We should not make the room harsher than it was, because people also found companionship there, and a job can be unpleasant without being without warmth. Someone might know a tune and hum it low. Someone might share tobacco near the doorway when the work slackened. Someone might tell news from the wharf, a rumor of a ship delayed, a change in wool prices, or a story from a farm inland where the shearing had gone badly because rain came at the wrong time. The human voice helped the hours pass. Still, much of the work settled into quiet. The tub drew your attention down, the steam narrowed the edges of the world, and each movement carried enough effort that talk became a luxury. You worked alongside others, yet alone inside your own repetition, counting without counting, lifting without naming each lift, and letting your body hold the knowledge that your mind no longer needed to supervise. There is a tired peace in such rhythm, though it is a peace purchased with soreness. By midday, the Hobart wool scourer has already lived through several versions of the same work, and we move with you into the part of the day when fatigue becomes part of the room. The early freshness is gone now. The first clean batches lie drying or waiting, the dirty water has been changed more than once, and the smell has deepened into something warm, sour, soapy, animal, and smoky all at the same time. You do not recoil from it. You simply breathe more shallowly. The light has shifted, and with it the color of the wool. In the morning, the fleece looked grey and yellow in the dimness, but now the cleaned locks catch a dull cream brightness where the daylight reaches them. Dust floats in the air, though perhaps dust is not quite the word, because the room carries bits of fiber, steam, ash, and the fine loosened matter that rises whenever wool is shaken or opened. It catches in the throat, not fiercely, but enough that you notice. The process keeps asking for care. A batch must not be left too long in the wrong water, because soaking is not the same as cleaning, and too much time can make the fibers suffer. Another must be lifted before the tub grows cool. Another must be rinsed so that no harsh trace remains. Your mind moves from one to another with the low concentration of someone tending many small fires, though the work is made of water. Rinsing seems simple, but simple work often hides its judgment. You take the scoured wool and move it through cleaner water, drawing out what the first tub loosened, watching the cloudiness fade, feeling the fibers grow less slick beneath your fingers. The water should run clearer, though never like mountain water, because wool carries its own faint shadow even when well cleaned. You lift, press, drain, and lift again, careful not to twist too hard, because rough handling can damage what all this effort is meant to improve. The soaked fleece pulls downward as if it has become part of the earth. You feel it through the arms first, then through the lower back, then in the knees when you bend to set it down. Every trade has a posture, and the wool scourer's posture is one of leaning, reaching, hauling, and standing again in air that never seems quite fresh. We notice it because the body remembers what records forget, and the body is where much of industrial history was truly written. In a warehouse account, the wool may be described by weight, quality, origin, and destination. In your day, it is described by touch. This lot is stubborn, that one holds grease, this one has burrs, that one opens nicely, this one smells strongly of the animal, and that one seems to carry half a paddock in its locks. You learn these differences without making a speech about them, and your hands begin to know the country through fleece, even if your boots never leave the yard. The Hobart of the 1880s sits nearby, always present at the edge of the shed. There are public houses, churches, workshops, warehouses, cottages, carts, gulls, horses, and the tidal smell of the harbour, and all of them seem to drift faintly into the room when the door opens. A worker may hear bells from town, a shouted instruction from the yard, or the creak of tackle from somewhere closer to the water. Those sounds remind you that your small station is tied to a larger movement. Wool wanted movement. It came from sheep, went to sheds, was pressed into bales, carried by cart, stored, opened, sorted, scoured, dried, packed again, moved to wharves, and eventually loaded for markets far beyond Van Diemen's Land, by then Tasmania, in name and administration. You may not follow it beyond the yard, but your labour travels with it invisibly. Somewhere, months later, a manufacturer might value the clean fibre, and no one there would know the heat of the tub that helped prepare it. This invisibility is part of the reason we stay close to you. History often has a clearer memory for owners, ships, governors, buildings, and figures written in ink, while the wet-handed worker becomes a faint shape behind the commodity. But the commodity was never abstract in the shed. It was smell, weight, stain, steam, and time. It was the ache in your thumb from gripping wet fleece, and the small line of dirt that remained on your wrist after washing. Perhaps a young worker learns the job by watching an older scourer who speaks only when necessary. He might say, "Not too hard, not so rough, lift it now, leave that one, spread it thinner, change the water." The teaching is plain and practical, offered in fragments between tasks, because the room itself gives the longer lesson. You learn by spoiling a little wool, by being corrected, by feeling the mistake in the fibre, and by remembering embarrassment better than instruction. There is humility in such learning, because the material will not flatter you. Wool responds to treatment, not intention. If you hurry it, it may mat. If you neglect it, it may remain greasy. If you overheat it, mishandle it, or let dirt redeposit, the results show plainly. The scourer learns that gentleness can be a form of efficiency, and that soft things are not always easy things. That lesson sits quietly inside the work. You cannot force the fleece clean by anger, and you cannot make a damp day dry by wishing. You do what can be done, in the order it can be done, and then you wait, checking and turning as needed. There is a kind of patience here that belongs to old labour, not peaceful exactly, but deeply practiced. Your mind may wander, yet your hands remain faithful to the next task. And when the afternoon light begins to lean lower, we remain with the 1880s Hobart wool scour, as the day enters its slower, heavier stretch. The body has warmed, tired, and settled into endurance. You no longer think much about the first tub, or the second, or how many times you have crossed the damp boards. The day is now a long band of repeated motion, and you are somewhere inside it, moving because stopping would make starting again harder. The afternoon in the shed has a different sound from the morning. Voices grow lower, movements become more economical, and the scrape of a basket or the slap of wet wool on a board seems louder because nobody has energy to waste. The boiler fire may need feeding, and the smell of smoke thickens briefly as the door opens and closes. Outside, the light might be clear on the harbour, but inside it softens through steam, dust, and the tired eyes of workers who have been staring at pale fibre for hours. This is the hour when small irritations grow. A knot that would have been merely awkward at dawn now feels personal. A tub that is too cool seems to accuse everyone at once. A basket placed in the wrong path catches your shin, and the pain spreads with unreasonable warmth because your patience is thin from labour. Yet the room does not erupt. It simply absorbs these moments, as old workplaces often did, letting annoyance pass into mutters, glances, and the next lift. The work still needs accuracy. Fatigue is not an excuse the wool understands. You keep the fleece moving through its stages, watch for dirt that clings near the base of locks, and notice when a batch is ready to leave the rinse. The fibres slide against your fingers differently when enough grease has gone. Clean wool is not bare of life, but it feels lighter, less closed, more able to breathe. You learn that feeling, and by afternoon you trust it more than sight. Drying racks and open spaces become crowded. Cleaned wool must be spread thin enough for air, but space is always a question. especially when weather resists and new work keeps arriving. You bend to lift a mass already partly drained, carry it, shake it gently loose, and lay it where warmth might reach. Tiny droplets flick onto your face. The wool brushes your wrists with a softness that almost mocks the hardness of carrying it. There might be a yard outside where wool dries in better weather, though Hobart's sky does not always cooperate. Rain can come softly, as if thinking aloud, or sharply enough to send everyone gathering what must not be soaked again. Wind can help drying, but too much wind carries dust, grit, or trouble. The wool scourer lives by these ordinary conditions, the same way a washerwoman, dyer, tanner, or fisherman learns that weather is not background, but part of the work. Inside, air movement is managed as best it can be. Doors are opened, then partly closed. Windows are propped, then shut against rain. Heat from the boiler is welcomed, then cursed, then welcomed again when the draft grows too cold on damp clothing. You stand in the middle of these adjustments, neither comfortable nor entirely miserable, simply aware that your body is a tool among other tools. It must be kept working, even if no one calls that maintenance. A wool scourer might not own much, but he owns small habits. He may set his cup in the same safe place each day, hang his coat on the same peg, choose the same side of the tub when he can, and fold his bit of food in cloth the same way before the morning begins. These habits make a rough day navigable. They are little landmarks in a place where the work itself seems to repeat without mercy. You follow them, as one follows a familiar path in fog. We can imagine the meal breaks not as rest in the modern sense, but as pauses between demands. A worker may step outside, where the cool air of Hobart touches his damp shirt and makes him shiver before it refreshes him. The harbour smell comes through: salt, weed, rope, tar, horse manure, and coal smoke, all mingling with the wool smell that refuses to leave. He drinks tea, perhaps too quickly, and looks at the sky to judge what kind of drying remains possible. The body speaks more plainly in those pauses. Hands tremble a little when they no longer have something to grip. The lower back stiffens as soon as bending stops. A thumb joint feels swollen. A patch of skin at the wrist burns where hot water found its way under a cuff. You might not complain because everyone has something similar, and because complaint does not warm water or lift fleece. But silence is not the same as ease. Still, there are moments of small beauty. Clean wool catching late light can look almost luminous. Not white exactly, but cream, straw, pearl, and smoke, depending on the fleece and the day. Steam rising around rafters can make the shed seem softer than it is. A row of drying wool may look like low clouds brought indoors and laid carefully across wood. You notice these things because workers notice what belongs to their day, even when the day is hard. The word sucked, if we use it gently, means the job took more from you than it gave back in comfort. It took dry clothes, clean air, uncracked hands, a straight back, and many hours that could not be spent elsewhere. Yet, it gave a wage, however modest, and it gave skill, however overlooked. It gave the satisfaction of seeing a dirty, greasy mass become something saleable and soft, a transformation you helped make with heat, water, and patience. In that way, the Hobart wool scourer's work belonged to a wider family of wet trades, humble trades, and trades with strong smells. Like laundering, tanning, dyeing, brewing, or paper-making, it depended on water behaving in particular ways, and on workers knowing those ways without always naming them. There was chemistry here, though not the kind written in lecture rooms. There was science in the tub, in the softening grease, in the action of soap, in the way heat changed the work, but you met it through sore arms rather than formulas. And as afternoon presses on, we move from the tubs and racks toward the quieter reckonings of the Hobart wool scourer's day, where quality, time, and tired judgment begin to gather together. A batch that seemed clean in poor light must be checked again. A patch that dried unevenly must be turned. A fleece that holds too much moisture must not be packed too soon. The last hours ask for attention precisely when attention has become harder to afford. Quality control, though that phrase may feel too modern for the shed, existed in every careful glance. You look for remaining dirt, uneven scouring, harshness, matting, and any sign that the fibers have been handled badly. The wool must feel right, open enough, clean enough, and dry enough for the next step. Too much moisture can lead to trouble in storage. Too much harsh treatment can lower value. Too little cleaning leaves the work visibly unfinished. This judgment may belong to a supervisor, a more experienced hand, or the person responsible for preparing wool to a buyer's expectation. But even if you are only one worker in the line, you know when something has gone well and when it has not. Workers carry standards inside them, sometimes stricter than the people who pay them, because the work passes through their hands and their pride attaches quietly to it. You may not speak of pride, you may still feel it. The shed has marks of many days before this one. Dark stains on boards show where water usually falls. The tub rim is polished where bodies lean. A hook has worn a groove in a beam. The floor near the boiler carries ash no sweeping fully removes. These details make the workplace feel almost like an old face, lined by repetition, plain in expression, and familiar enough that you could cross it half asleep and still know where the boards dip. You, as the scourer, are marked in similar ways. Your body learns routes through space and habits of effort that remain after the shift. Even at home, your hands may make washing motions in a basin. Your shoulders may hold a forward curve, and the smell of wool may rise again when damp clothes warm near a hearth. Work does not end neatly at the door. It loosens slowly, like steam leaving cloth. In the 1880s, Hobart was not an enormous industrial city, but its working life was dense with practical skill. There were shipwrights, coopers, carters, storemen, washerwomen, bakers, smiths, rope workers, domestic servants, and all the people whose labor kept goods moving through a colonial port. The wool scourer stood among them, part of the town's ordinary machinery of hands, not celebrated, not central in speeches, but necessary in the way hinges are necessary, quietly carrying movement. The wool itself could have come from estates and small holdings where sheep moved across dry grass, wet slopes, or rougher country inland. By the time it reached you, the animal was gone from sight, but not from touch. The fleece retained the curve of growth, the cling of grease, the smell of weather, and the memory of movement through scrub and pasture. Cleaning. It was almost like reading backward through the animal's season, though there was no time to be poetic about it, while the tub waited. Still, we may be poetic now because we are listening across years and because the quiet facts deserve more than a line in a shipping record. You place your hands into the work and the wool changes. Water clouds, steam rises, dirt loosens, the clean fibers gather light. The shed breathes in heat and breathes out damp. These are small transformations, but the world is made of small transformations repeated until they become trade, industry, habit, and memory. If a buyer later praised a fine bale, he might praise the grower, the clip, the season, or the quality of the flock. He might not praise the scourer, but a poor scouring could be noticed quickly, because overlooked labor often becomes visible only when it fails. That is another quiet sting of the job. Good work disappears into the value of the thing, while bad work returns as blame. You learn, therefore, to make your care invisible. The drying wool must be gathered when ready, and this gathering is gentler than washing, but still tiring. You lift the loosened masses, now lighter than before, though still bulky, and carry them to be weighed, sorted, packed, or moved along. Loose fibers cling to sleeves and float against your face. The air is drier near some racks and wetter near others, and your fingers test the difference without ceremony. A fleece that feels dry on the outside may hide dampness within, so you open it and let the air speak. There is a sound to dry wool as well, faint and whispering. It does not slap like wet fleece or sigh in the tub. It rustles, barely, and if you press it near your ear, you might hear the tiny shift of fibers against one another. The smell changes too, from raw animal heaviness to something cleaner but still warm, with lanolin remaining as a soft trace. The wool has not become perfume. It has become acceptable, and when late afternoon begins to draw the warmth out of the yard, we stay close to the Hobart wool scour as the day turns toward clearing, packing, and the putting away of tired things. The work is not over simply because the washing slows. The room must be made ready to endure another morning. Water must be dealt with, tools rinsed, tubs cleared, fires watched, wet scraps gathered, and the floor made safe enough for the next round of feet. This closing labor can feel especially heavy because it produces no new clean wool to admire. It is maintenance, and maintenance is one of the hidden foundations of every old trade. A paddle left dirty becomes foul. A tub neglected carries yesterday into tomorrow. A drain blocked at dusk becomes a problem at dawn. You tend these things not because anyone praises you, but because future discomfort is also a kind of debt, and workers know how quickly it collects. Dirty water carries away more than dirt. It carries the day's heat, smell, grease, and evidence, flowing off in dull streams that leave marks along channels and drains. Where it goes depends on the yard and the arrangements of the place, but it does not vanish in any magical sense. Old industries often moved their waste from one part of life to another, into drains, soil, creeks, harbour edges, and low places people tried not to think about. The Scourer sees at least the first part of that journey. You rinse the tools in water that is no longer clean enough for wool, but still useful for removing the worst of the day. The paddle feels different now, slick in places, rough in others, and heavier because your hands are tired. You stand it where it belongs. You clear clumps from the floor. You push stray locks into a pile. Each small act says the shift is ending, though the body may not believe it yet. The room cools unevenly. Near the boiler, warmth remains like an old thought. Near the door, evening enters early, carrying the damp breath of Hobart and perhaps the smell of rain on stone. The steam thins, and things that were hidden by vapor become clear again. Tub edges, wet boards, hooks, baskets, and the bent shape of someone tying a sack or lifting one last load. The shed becomes less like a cloud and more like a room. You may notice your own clothing more sharply now. The apron is damp and stiff. The shirt clings at the back. The cuffs are darkened. The boots carry wool fibers and grit. Your hands, when held away from the work, look pale in the creases and reddened across the knuckles, as if the day has written there in water and heat. You flex them slowly, and the skin pulls. Outside, the town has shifted into evening. Hooves sound different on cooler streets. Voices carry farther. A gull calls over the harbour, and somewhere a door closes, with the hollow certainty of a shop ending its trade. Hobart's hills may darken before the waterfront does, and the sky over the Derwent may hold a last grey brightness while the yard itself grows shadowed. You stand between the warmth you are leaving and the cold you are about to enter. There is no grand finish. That is part of the truth. The 1880s Hobart wool scour does not complete the day with applause, or even with a visible ending that marks all effort as worthwhile. The wool moves onward. The tubs wait. The smell remains. The wage, when paid, must stretch into food, rent, fuel, clothing, and the ordinary needs that arrive with calm regularity. Tomorrow, if work continues, the fleece will be there again. Yet in this plain ending there is a kind of rest. Not comfort exactly, but release. You have done what the day asked, and though the day asked a great deal, it is no longer asking for the moment. Your arms hang differently. Your back straightens with caution. Your ears notice smaller sounds now that the water has stopped moving. The room, which all day seemed to demand, begins to settle around you. We can stay in that settling for a while, because sleep likes such endings. The tools return to their places. The tubs darken as their surfaces cool. A last thread of steam lifts and disappears near a beam. Loose wool clings to a corner where the broom missed it, soft as a small remnant of cloud. The floor keeps its damp shine in the fading light, and the smell of lanolin, soap, smoke, and timber remains folded into the walls. If you walk home, the air outside feels almost startling. It is cooler, wider, and touched by salt from the harbour. Your damp clothing chills quickly, and you pull your coat closer, feeling the workday's warmth leave you in slow layers. The streets may be muddy, and the sounds of evening ordinary, but after the scouring room, even ordinary air feels clean enough to notice. You carry the day with you anyway, in your hands, your sleeves, and the deep tiredness behind your shoulders. Perhaps someone at home asks little about the work, because the answer is always much the same. Wool came in, wool was washed, wool was dried. The water was hot, the room was damp, and the body grew tired. But sameness is not emptiness. Inside that same answer live hundreds of decisions, sensations, adjustments, and small acts of endurance. A life can be made of repeated days without becoming simple. And as night gathers over Hobart, we let the wool scourer's world grow quieter, while the cleaned fleece rests somewhere in the dark, lighter than it was when morning began. The harbour holds its ships. The yards hold their carts. The shed holds its smell. The tubs hold a little remaining damp in their seams. Work has passed through all these things and left them changed, though only slightly, as water changes wood and hands change tools. The reason it sucked to be an 1880s Hobart wool scour was not that every moment was misery, because few real jobs are so neat in their suffering. It was that the hardship lived in repetition, in dampness, in heat, in low regard, in the body's slow spending of itself on work that others saw only after it had become clean, packed, and profitable. It was difficult because it was ordinary. It was exhausting because it had to be done again. But we do not leave the scourer only with hardship. We leave him with the dignity of skill, with the knowledge of fibre and water, with the practiced gentleness required to clean without ruining, and with the quiet endurance of someone whose work helped move a town's trade forward. The world was softer because his hands had laboured in rough conditions. That is not romance. It is simply one of the many truths hidden inside a bale of wool. The shed is nearly still now. The last warmth fades from the tub rims. The paddle leans in shadow, clean enough for morning. Somewhere beyond the walls, the tide moves against the harbour stones, patient and dark, while the wool rests in its bundles, and the night lays itself over Hobart with a cool, even hand. The work will return, but not yet. And for this moment, there is only the quiet after water, the smell of timber, and the body slowly letting go. The next morning seems to arrive before the ache has fully left, as if the night merely folded itself around your shoulders and then unfolded again before dawn. You return to the yard with the chill still on the stones, and the Hobart air smells of wet rope, horse sweat, coal smoke, and the faint salt of the harbour. The shed waits in the half-light, not welcoming exactly, but familiar in the way a hard place becomes familiar when it has taken the shape of your days. Inside, the tubs are quiet for only a little while, and that quiet has a particular feeling, almost like a held breath before the first bucket is poured. You can see pale scraps of wool caught in cracks between boards, and the dark stains near the drains show where yesterday's work passed through. We stand with you as the fire is coaxed back into usefulness, as the boiler begins its low ticking, and as the first thin threads of steam rise with a smell of old water and warmed iron. The 1880s Hobart wool scourer does not begin by making anything beautiful, because the early work is closer to preparation, repetition, and the sorting of things that other people have bundled together. Bales must be opened, fleece must be loosened, and the raw wool must be judged before washing can begin. Your hands enter the mass carefully, feeling for clumps, damp patches, vegetable matter, hard burrs, and locks that might need more attention than the rest, while the morning cold slowly leaves your fingers. There is something intimate about raw fleece, though not in a comfortable way. It carries the animal's year in its folds, and it brings the outside world into the shed more honestly than any written label could. You smell paddock dust, old rain, lanolin, dung, dry grass, and the warm musk of sheep, all pressed together under twine and weight. When the bale opens, the scent expands, and the room accepts it without surprise. You may find thistles, seeds, straw, and little hardened bits of earth caught where the fibres have grown close. Some can be picked free before scouring, while some will loosen only after the water has done its quiet work. You learn not to be offended by what the fleece contains, because it came from a living animal moving through real country, and real country is never perfectly clean. The job is not to judge the dirt. The job is to remove what can be removed without harming what matters. The wool has grades and qualities, and the people above you may speak of them in terms of price, fineness, staple, and reputation. You know those things too, but you know them through touch, through the pull of a lock between finger and thumb, and through the way a fleece opens or resists when warmed. Some wool seems almost eager to loosen, while some stays tight and greasy, as if the sheep's own weather has sealed it shut. In that resistance, you feel the future labor of the day. The first tub receives its load with a heavy softness, and the water closes over the wool in a slow, cloudy folding. You press it down with the paddle, not sharply, but with a steady downward persuasion, watching bubbles rise and burst along the surface. The tub begins to change color almost at once, turning from clear warmth to a yellowed, smoky liquor that smells strongly of grease and animal heat. It is not an elegant transformation, yet it is the beginning of value. Your sleeves darken near the wrists, even if you try to keep them clear, because old work has a way of entering whatever space you leave unguarded. The steam touches your face and makes the shed seem smaller. The paddle knocks once against the tub, and the sound travels through wood, water, and your arm. We can feel how the day is assembling itself around you, one familiar discomfort at a time. The trouble with being a Hobart wool scourer in the 1880s is that the work asks for strength and restraint at once, and those two demands do not rest easily together. You must lift wet weight, but handle it gently. You must work quickly enough to keep the batches moving, but slowly enough that the wool does not mat or suffer. You must endure the heat, but also keep your mind cool enough to notice what the fleece needs. That tension lives in the hands. A rough grip can do harm, but a weak grip cannot lift enough. A hurried turn may felt the fibers, while too much hesitation lets the water cool and the grease tighten again. So you learn a kind of deliberate strength, a plain working gentleness that has nothing sentimental about it. It is gentleness learned because the material demands it, and because wages may depend on the quality of what leaves the shed. The tub is not silent. Beneath the louder sounds of boots and buckets, there is a private language of water moving through wool. It gulps softly when a mass is pressed under, it trickles when lifted, it taps and runs from the draining board in many small threads. If you listen for too long, those sounds seem to fill the whole morning, and the rest of Hobart recedes behind them, as though the town itself has gone under water. At times, the shed door opens and brings in a blade of cold air that cuts through the steam and makes everyone briefly aware of their damp skin. A cart may be backing near the yard, its wheels grinding over wet gravel, its horse shifting with the patient discomfort of an animal waiting to be unloaded. Men call to one another outside, and their voices arrive softened by timber walls. You hear enough to know the world continues, but not enough to leave the tub in your mind. The water must be managed with care, because heat is part of the work's hidden arithmetic. Too cool, and the grease remains. Too hot, and the fiber may be harmed, while your own skin suffers for every careless degree. In a later age, instruments might make this feel exact, but here the knowledge is partly in the touch, partly in the steam, partly in the memory of what went wrong before. Your wrist knows warnings before your words do. The scouring mixture may have soap, soda, or other cleansing help, depending on the shed's habits and the wool's condition, and each choice changes the feel of the water. Soap gives a softness and slip, while stronger alkali can bite at the skin and make small cracks announce themselves sharply. You learn to tell when the liquor has lost its strength, when it is carrying more grease than it can hold, and when the batch is no longer being cleaned, but merely soaked in yesterday's trouble. That knowledge is practical, almost wordless, and not easily written on a ledger. By now, your breathing has adjusted to the room. You do not inhale deeply unless you have to. The smell is thickest when a fresh fleece enters the warm water, and for a few moments it seems to rise as a single body: wool grease, dirt, sheep, steam, smoke, and damp wood. Then it spreads into the rafters and becomes ordinary again. You continue. There are workers whose lives are shaped by dryness, by dust, grain, flour, sawdust, lime, or road grit, and there are workers whose lives are shaped by wetness. The wool scour belongs to the second kind. Wet floors, wet sleeves, wet aprons, wet boots, wet wool, and wet air make a climate that follows you from morning until evening. Even when the fire is warm, you are not quite comfortable, because dampness has its own chill beneath heat. A soaked apron grows heavy in a way that is hard to explain until you have worn one for hours. It pulls at the neck, stiffens at the belly, and brushes cold against the thighs when you step away from the tub. Your shirt may be warm near the chest and cold along the arms, and this unevenness becomes part of the day's quiet irritation. We stay with that feeling because it is one of the small truths that made the job hard. Your hands become used to unpleasant mixtures, grease and soap, warm water and grit, soft fiber and hidden burr, smooth lanolin and rough dirt that rasps against the skin. The contrast repeats so often that it becomes almost hypnotic. And yet, beneath the rhythm, there is always the chance of a sharp seed, a splintered board, or a cracked nail catching where tenderness has already formed. The work is soft to look at and abrasive to live inside. There may be a supervisor watching the pace, though perhaps not constantly, because old workplaces often trusted pressure itself to supervise. The piles of waiting wool are visible. The cooling tub is visible. The damp drying racks are visible. You do not need a clock to remind you that work remains, because the room displays its unfinished business everywhere you look. In such a place, idleness feels impossible, even when the body asks for it. Still, the day contains little pauses that are almost invisible from outside. A moment while water drains, a breath while another worker shifts a basket, a brief standing still as you test whether a batch needs another rinse. These are not rests exactly, but they are spaces where thought can pass through. Perhaps you think of breakfast, rent, a child's cough, a hole in a boot, or nothing at all beyond the next lift. The next lift always comes. Wet wool must be raised with both hands, held above the tub long enough to drain, then transferred with care so that it does not fall in a heavy slap and undo your neatness. Water streams from it in shining lines, returning with a sound that can be soothing if your shoulders did not have to hold the weight. Your arms tremble slightly by the time the fleece is set down, and the trembling fades only because the next movement claims it. This is one of the ways repetitive work hides its severity. No single lift seems worth complaint. No single tub explains the whole exhaustion. But after hours, after days, after months, the body keeps a private account more exact than any employer's book. It counts the bends, the reaches, the heavy loads, the damp chill, the hot steam, and the small pains carried forward because there is no proper moment to set them down. In 1880s Hobart, a wool scourer might work near men whose names never entered public memory, though their labor traveled through every bale they touched. They may have come from families of laborers, from rural backgrounds, from city poverty, from other trades when work was short, or from the restless movement common to colonial towns. We do not need to invent too much about them to honor them. It is enough to notice the conditions that shaped their hours. The town itself was changing, as towns always are, with new buildings, old habits, colonial institutions, ships, roads, and the ongoing business of turning land, animals, and labor into goods. Wool was part of that story, but the fleece did not move through history by itself. It passed through hands like yours, through yards that smelled of wet timber and grease, through carts, presses, stores, and ships. The grander story has a soft underside, and this shed is part of it. When you work a stubborn fleece, you may feel irritation rise, but the irritation cannot be spent recklessly. The wool will not become easier because you resent it. So you adjust your grip, work water through the locks again, and separate a clump that is held onto dirt with a kind of dull loyalty. Your patience becomes physical, not moral. It lives in the pressure of your fingers. A good scourer learns when to leave a thing alone. Too much handling can be as harmful as too little, and overwork may turn useful fiber into a matted disappointment. This is a difficult lesson in a shed, where effort is visible and restraint may look like slowness. But you learn that the best result sometimes comes from letting warm water do what warm water does, while your hands guide rather than command. The quiet trades often teach this balance. The rinse water is clearer than the first tub, but it soon takes on a faint cloud because cleanliness arrives gradually. You move the wool through it, lifting and settling, making room for the loosened traces to leave. The fibers brighten. They open. They lose some of their animal heaviness, yet they remain wool, still smelling faintly of lanolin, still carrying the softness that made all the hardship financially worthwhile to someone further along the chain. The drying area asks for another kind of attention, and we follow you there with the wool cradled awkwardly against your forearms. Cleaned fleece must be spread, not dumped, because air needs paths through the mass. You shake it gently, tease it open, and lay it out in loose reaches that catch the warmer currents moving through the shed. Droplets strike the boards. A faint mist rises where warmth meets moisture. The work slows, but it does not ease. When the weather is kind, the drying seems almost cooperative, and the wool lightens visibly through the hours. When the weather is damp, the same fleece lies stubbornly cool and heavy, as though it has decided to keep a memory of the tub. Hobart's weather could be changeable, and a worker learned to read it not from romance, but from inconvenience. A cloud meant delay. A wind meant opportunity or dust. Rain meant trouble, if wool had been set where rain could reach. You check the drying wool with the side of your hand. Not the palm only, because the palm lies sometimes after too much wet work, but the back of the fingers, the wrist, the little instinctive tests a worker develops without naming them. A patch that feels cool may still be holding moisture. A dense fold may need opening. A rack near the draft may dry faster than one near the wall. Your body becomes a measuring instrument, imperfect but practiced. This is where the job can become strangely meditative. You turn, lift, spread, and return. You watch the same wool change by small degrees, and your mind follows that slow change without needing excitement. Sleepy work, if it did not hurt so much, might almost be peaceful. The shed has a rhythm like breathing, heat gathering, steam thinning, water draining, wool opening, workers moving in repeated paths across the damp boards. But the peace is never pure, because livelihood presses quietly behind every motion. If the work is slow, someone may lose patience. If the weather delays drying, space becomes crowded. If the quality disappoints, blame may travel downward faster than payment travels upward. You know these things without dwelling on them, the way one knows a cold draft is present without thinking about the whole shape of the door. The wool scourer's day is not heroic, and that is why it matters here. It belongs to the enormous category of work that made life possible without becoming legend. The bread was baked, the horses shod, the lamps lit, the drains cleared, the wool scoured, the sails patched, the barrels coopered, the floors scrubbed, and the goods moved on. Civilization rests on such verbs. They are plain, and they are endless. In the shed, plainness has weight. A basket is not merely a basket when it is full of wet fleece. A tub is not merely a tub when its water must be kept warm and workable. A floor is not merely a floor when a wrong step can wrench a tired knee. A day is not merely a day when it repeats often enough to shape the spine. You learn the seriousness of ordinary objects. At times, you may look at the cleaned wool and think it almost too soft to belong to the same day as your hands. The fibers lie in pale waves, airy now, taking light gently, with little shadows in the folds. If someone who had never worked the tub touched it, they might speak only of softness. You would know the softness had been earned through heat, smell, water, and the ache of many careful lifts. That knowledge changes the way softness feels. The sounds outside shift again as carts come and go. A wheel splashes through a shallow rut. A horse snorts, stamping once. Men lift, call, grunt, and fall quiet. Beyond them, the town continues with its shops, houses, kitchens, offices, and yards, each with its own smells and labours. The wool shed is only one room in a larger breathing body, and yet, for you, it is the centre of the day. We might imagine a passerby catching only a glimpse through the doorway, steam in the air, pale wool spread out, workers moving slowly in damp aprons. The scene might look almost picturesque from far enough away. Distance has a way of smoothing hardship into atmosphere. But we are not far away. We are close enough to feel the tub rim against the hip, to notice the skin tightening over wet knuckles, and to hear the quiet exhale before another lift. That closeness matters, because the phrase "why it sucked" can be too easily flattened into complaint, when the true answer is more patient. It sucked because the discomfort was not exceptional, but continuous. It sucked because the work was skilled without being honored as skilled. It sucked because the warmth that made the wool clean made the air heavy, and the water that carried away grease carried comfort from the body too. It sucked because tomorrow did not promise a different rhythm, and yet you keep going because work is often not chosen from a shelf of ideal possibilities. It is taken where it can be found, learned where it is offered, endured where it pays, and sometimes made meaningful because the hands insist on doing it well. The Hobart wool scourer may not speak grandly about duty, but he still knows when a batch has been properly handled. He knows the feel of work done correctly. That knowledge is small and sustaining. As the day leans onward, the room begins to show layers of labor. Dirty wool waits in one place, wet wool drains in another, clean wool dries in another, and finished wool gathers where it can be moved along. Each layer has its own smell, weight, and sound. The dirty pile is dense and animal. The wet pile is heavy and dripping. The drying fleece is airy and cool. The finished wool is lighter, quieter, and almost shy in the hand. You move between these states as though moving through the life of the material, from animal warmth to market readiness, from grease to cleanliness, from paddock to port. The fleece passes through stages that are humble but precise. Your work is one passage in that journey, and while others may call it simple, you know simplicity can be made of many careful acts placed in the right order. A missed act leaves a mark. There is no need to hurry the telling, because the work itself had no clean shortcut. Water needed time to heat. Grease needed time to soften. Wool needed time to drain. Air needed time to dry what water had entered. The body needed rest it often did not receive. Every part of the process argued against haste, even while commerce and wages urged the workers to move faster. This was the old contradiction humming beneath the shed. A man may try to save his back by learning better ways to lift. He bends differently, shifts weight through the legs when there is room, uses the tub edge carefully, and shares a heavy load when another pair of hands is near. But the room is not designed around kindness to the spine. It is designed around getting wool through the process with the tools available. Your body adapts, and adaptation is not the same as comfort. If the shed employs younger workers, they may begin with impatience and too much force. Youth often mistakes effort for skill. An older scourer might watch a young hand push too roughly, then correct him with a brief word, because damaged wool teaches everyone at once. Over time, the younger worker learns to let the water carry some of the labor. He learns that a careful hand is faster in the end than a violent one. The day's social order is present but mostly unspoken. Some give orders, some carry them out, some judge the product, some keep the accounts. The worker at the tub may know exactly how to save a batch, yet still have little say in wages, hours, or conditions. That imbalance sits quietly in the steam. It does not need drama to be real. We stay with the worker, not to make the past into misery alone, but to restore proportion. A bale of wool had value because land, sheep, weather, shearing, sorting, scouring, packing, shipping, and selling all met inside it. The soft material held a whole chain of effort. The scourer's effort was wet, warm, repetitive, and easy for others to overlook, which is exactly why it deserves to be seen slowly. By late day, the cleaned wool seems to gather the remaining light. The shed may be dimmer now, but the pale fibre still catches brightness where it can, turning grey corners softer for a little while. Steam rises less heavily as fires are adjusted and tubs are emptied. Voices come back in small pieces, not lively, but relieved that the hardest stretches have passed. You hear someone cough, someone laugh quietly, someone drag a basket across the boards. The final checking begins to feel almost tender. You open a fold, test a dry patch, gather a loose edge, and shake a fleece once more so air can pass through it. The wool brushes your skin with a softness that no longer seems innocent. You know what it weighed. You know what it smelled like. You know what the water looked like after it had surrendered its dirt. A person who has cleaned something thoroughly never sees it quite the same way again. If packing follows, it brings its own compression, its own undoing of the airiness you helped restore. Wool that has been opened and dried must be gathered, pressed, bundled, and prepared for the next journey. The softness disappears into density again, though now it is cleaner, lighter, and more valuable. You may feel a small regret at seeing it packed down, like watching a cloud folded into a box. But trade prefers tidy shapes. The marks on the bale matter to those who read them. Origin, owner, grade, weight, and destination may be recorded, while the individual wet hours vanish. Ink can hold a merchant's name more easily than a worker's ache. Still, the work is present, even unnamed, because the wool would not be the same without it. Hidden labor is not absent labor, it is merely quiet. Evening comes slowly in the telling, because in the shed it comes through many signs. The fire is no longer built up with the same urgency. The last batch is no longer followed by another fresh one. The floor is cleared enough that you can see parts again. The light through the doorway changes from working grey to something cooler, more blue, and the air outside seems to wait for you with a gentler face than the one it wore at dawn. You clean your hands, though cleaning them fully is impossible. Warm water removes the surface grime, and rubbing removes some of the grease, but the smell remains in small places. It hides beside nails, under the edges of skin, and in the cloth at your wrists. You might scrub harder if you had the strength, yet there is a point in the evening when the hands cannot be made new, only less dirty. That has to be enough. The Hobart wool scourer steps out carrying the day in his body. The harbour air reaches him, and the first breath feels larger than the shed allowed. Behind him the room settles into damp quiet, with tubs cooling, tools leaning, and bits of pale fibre still caught where broom and eye have missed them. Ahead, the town waits with its lamps, kitchens, muddy lanes, and ordinary human needs. Work has ended, but life has not become weightless. You may pass other workers on the way, each carrying a different smell. Smoke from a smithy, flour from a bakehouse, fish from the waterfront, horse and leather from a stable, soap from a laundry, timber from a yard. The town in the evening is a map of labour-made scent, and your own place on that map is wool grease, damp cloth, and the warm animal note that clings no matter how cool the air becomes. There is comfort in walking slowly after such work, even if the legs are tired. The ground is firm compared with the wet boards. The open air moves around you rather than pressing down. A cart rattles past, and the sound fades behind you without needing attention. You let the body lengthen carefully, step by step, as though reminding it that it is more than the shape it held over the tub. At home, the evening may be modest. A basin, a fire if fuel allows. Food that tastes better because the body has earned hunger honestly, though hunger itself is no romance. Perhaps there are voices, family, neighbours, a room shared too closely, a chair that is not quite comfortable but still better than standing. You sit, and the day begins its slow retreat. The hands remain awake longer than the rest of you. Sometimes in half sleep, the work may return as sensation rather than memory. Water slipping from wool, a paddle in the hand, steam against the face, the drag of wet fleece, the warm, sour smell rising when a fresh batch enters the tub. The mind repeats what the body has repeated, and even dreams may move in the old rhythm of lift, drain, spread, and return. This is another way the job takes space. It occupies not only the paid hours, but the hours after, when muscles twitch and skin tightens, and the smell of the shed seems to rise again from drying clothes. A person can leave a workplace and still have it living in the body for a while. The 1880s Hobart wool scourer knew this without needing a phrase for it. He felt it when he lay still. And as night settles more deeply, we can let the room, the yard, and the worker's body all soften toward rest, without pretending the work was easier than it was. The tubs are dark now. The boiler has lost its voice. The wool lies bundled or spread, waiting in whatever stage the day left it. The shed holds the memory of heat inside damp timber, and outside, the harbour breathes against the town in slow, black water. Tomorrow, the same work may begin again, and that repetition is part of the heaviness. But tonight, there is a pause long enough to inhabit. The hands no longer lift, the back no longer bends, the water no longer clouds, the fleece no longer pulls against the arms. For a few hours, the world does not ask the scourer to turn grease into value. It only lets him sleep, while the smell of wool fades a little into the dark. By morning, the scent returns before the full light does, because the shed has kept its own memory through the hours when people were gone. Damp timber holds yesterday. The tubs hold yesterday. Even the air near the rafters seems to have slept with wool grease folded inside it. And when you open the door, that old, warm animal smell rises again to meet the cold Hobart dawn. You step inside with the caution of someone returning to a place that knows the shape of your labour. The boards answer under your boots with small damp sounds, and the first light lies thinly across the floor, catching pale fibers left from the previous day. We are with you in that quiet first moment, before the tub is filled and before the first bale is opened, when the work has not yet become weight, though it is already waiting. The 1880s Hobart wool scourer begins again by making readiness from disorder, gathering baskets, checking tubs, setting tools within reach, and noticing what the night has changed. A rack may still be cool to the touch. A corner may smell sour where damp wool sat too long. A paddle may need another rinse before it can be trusted. The day starts with these little examinations, because neglected details become larger troubles once water, heat, and tired hands are involved. There is an old wisdom in preparing the place before the work grows loud. You learn where the first batch will go, where the next will drain, and which path across the boards is least treacherous after yesterday's spilling. The room seems simple, but it has currents like a harbour, and you move through them best when you remember where heat gathers, where drafts enter, and where a basket left carelessly can turn a tired ankle. Outside, Hobart is waking under a sky that may be low with cloud, and the harbour sounds come through as if from another life. A gull cries once over the wharf. A cart rattles somewhere beyond the yard. Hooves strike stone with that hollow morning rhythm found in old towns before engines make the air too full. You hear all of it faintly, but the shed draws your attention inward toward the first bale and the first tub. When the bale is opened, the fleece expands with slow insistence, no longer pressed into its travelling shape, and the smell of the run comes out with it. You can almost feel the dry paddock in the dust that shakes loose, though your feet stand on wet boards near the harbour. Bits of grass cling to the locks. Burrs hide in the dense places. Yellowed grease holds the fibres together. What looks soft from a distance becomes complicated in the hand. The raw wool must be teased enough for water to enter it. You pull apart clumps carefully, not making it neat, but making it possible. If the wool enters the tub too tightly held, the water passes around rather than through, and the dirt remains tucked inside. So you open it with fingers that are already becoming tacky with grease, feeling the fibre resist, then loosen, then fall into a more workable shape. This preparatory work is quieter than scouring, and in another life it might seem almost domestic. Hands separating fibres, a worker leaning over a basket, light touching the pale edges of wool. But the scale makes it different, and the expectations make it harder. There is always more fleece waiting than one pair of hands wants to see, and each mass carries its own small arguments, its knots, its dirt, its stubborn greasy weight. The fire comes alive by degrees, and warmth begins to gather in the iron and water. At first, the shed is cold enough that your breath might show near the doorway, while the tub water gives off only a faint promise of steam. Then, as the fire settles, the air near the boiler thickens, and the smell of smoke joins the wool smell until both seem woven together. You feel the day warm before you feel ready for it. The water needs coaxing, not merely heating. It must reach the right useful warmth and then be held near that state while the work pulls heat away with every batch. A tub is not a fixed thing. Once wool enters it, the fleece cools it, dirt alters it, grease burdens it, and the worker must read these changes while also lifting, pressing, draining, and preparing what comes next. This is why simple work can still ask for constant attention. You lower the first opened wool into the tub, and the whole morning seems to lean forward with it. The fibers float briefly, resisting the water as though trying to remain air, then slowly take in warmth and sink under the paddle's gentle pressure. A cloudy ring spreads outward. The smell deepens. Steam touches your eyelashes. The room has begun again. You press and turn, press and wait, then lift the edge and let the water move through, and every motion must be firm without becoming rough. Wool is forgiving in some ways and unforgiving in others. It will accept patience, but not carelessness. It will open to warmth, but punish violence. In the tub, you learn that the softest terms, a younger worker might think washing means scrubbing, because the word carries that idea in the mind. But scouring wool is less like scrubbing a pot, and more like persuading a tightly held secret to loosen. You work the water through, you allow soap or cleansing liquor to find the grease, you keep the fleece moving enough that dirt leaves, but not so much that fibers catch and cling. The skill lies in what does not look dramatic. The first dirty water is always the most expressive. It turns yellow, brown, grey, or dull cream depending on the fleece, and it carries the day's first truth plainly on its surface. This is what came in hidden. This is what must leave. You watch it cloud with a tired acceptance, because a clean-looking fleece may still darken a tub, and a miserable-looking one may sometimes behave better than expected. The wool has its own character, and it reveals itself slowly. Your hands disappear beneath the surface, and return slick, warm and shining with diluted grease. The lanolin is not unpleasant at first, and some might even call it softening, but in the shed it comes mixed with everything else, the animal and the land supplied. It coats the skin, catches grit, and makes tools feel subtly different in the grip. By mid-morning, your hands no longer feel like clean hands made dirty, but like working hands belonging to the room. The Hobart wool scourer of the 1880s lives inside these distinctions. Clean enough, warm enough, dry enough, open enough. Too greasy, too harsh, too damp, too tight. These are not abstract judgments, because each one decides what your body must do next. A word such as enough becomes a working measure, held in the wrist and eye, carried from batch to batch, and corrected by consequences. There is a kind of clock inside the process, though it is not made of brass or hanging on a wall. The first tub speaks one time, the rinse speaks another. The drying rack speaks more slowly. The weather outside speaks when it pleases. You move among these overlapping measures, guided by steam, touch, color, weight, and the memory of how long the last batch took under similar conditions. Industrial time, in this shed, is still partly weather time. And as the morning opens further, we follow the wool from its first dirty loosening toward the harder middle stage, where the Hobart wool scourer must keep water, fiber, and body in careful motion. The first batch cannot be forgotten just because the second has begun. Nothing in the shed finishes politely before the next thing asks to be started. Work overlaps work, and that is one reason the day feels fuller than it looks from outside. The drained fleece waits with water still running from it in thin threads. You lift it and feel the weight pull at your shoulders, then set it where the next water can receive it. The rinse is clearer, cooler at the edges, and less burdened with grease, but it becomes cloudy soon enough. You move the wool through it with a slow rocking motion, allowing loosened dirt and cleansing traces to slip away. The fibers begin to feel more separate beneath your hands. Rinsing requires humility, because it reveals whether the first stage was truly done. If grease still clings heavily, the rinse tells on you. If dirt remains in the center of the locks, the water shows it. If the fleece was handled too roughly, the texture complains. You may wish a batch were ready, but wool is not persuaded by wishing. It must actually be ready in the plain bodily sense your fingers can test. Water streams from the lifted fleece, warmer at first, then cooling as it runs over your wrists. The sound gathers beneath the draining board, a steady patter that might be pleasant if the load were not dragging against your arms. You let it drain as long as the pace allows, because every moment of dripping saves a little weight from being carried across the room. Even patience, here, can be a way of protecting the back. The floor grows busier as the day advances. A trail of water marks the path from tub to board. Stray locks cling to boots and move around the room like pale little ghosts. A basket leans where it should not. Someone shifts it with a foot rather than bending, because bending has become an expense to be considered. These small economies of movement appear when labor is long and the body begins keeping accounts. You notice the temperature most when you leave one part of the room for another. Near the tub, your face is warm and damp. Near the doorway, the air slips under your wet cuff and makes the skin contract. Near the racks, the warmth is gentler, spread out and mingled with wool's clean, damp smell. The shed is not one climate, but many small climates, and you pass through them all before the day is done. The drying wool needs room, and room is often what the day refuses to provide. Each fleece must be opened enough for air, yet the shed is finite. The racks are finite, and the weather may have shortened every possibility outside. You spread one batch, then shift another, then return to the first because a fold has settled too thickly. It is slow work that punishes forgetting. Moisture hides where attention thins. A clean fleece laid too densely can become a problem in silence. It does not shout or spill, it simply keeps dampness in its heart, cooling where it should dry. and waiting to trouble someone later. So you open it again, patient though tired, lifting the edges, loosening clumps, letting air find what water has left behind. This is the kind of diligence no passerby would notice, yet it belongs to good work as surely as the first washing. The smell around the drying racks is different from the smell near the dirty bales. Cleaner, yes, but still alive with fiber, warmth, and the faint sweetness of remaining lanolin. It has a softer edge. If you close your eyes, you might almost separate the scents by stage: raw fleece sharp and animal, first tub heavy and sour, rinse water mild and soapy, drying wool warm and pale. The nose becomes another tool, though nobody lists it among the equipment. There are times when a worker can judge trouble by smell before sight. Wool left too wet has a different note. Dirty liquor that needs changing announces itself. A tub that has cooled and grown tired smells duller, less active, more burdened. These impressions are hard to defend in words, but old trades often trust them. The body knows what repeated exposure teaches, even when the mind does not turn it into a rule. By mid-morning, speech in the shed becomes practical and brief. Lift there. Mind the water. That one needs more. Leave it longer. Watch the edge. Someone asks for a hand, and another worker comes, not out of ceremony, but because certain weights are easier with two. In such moments, fellowship is not sentimental. It is a pair of hands arriving before the strain becomes injury. You learn who works smoothly and who wastes effort. You learn who leaves tools where they should be, who splashes carelessly, who notices when a tub cools, and who can be trusted with a difficult batch. These opinions may never be spoken fully, but they shape the room. A good worker makes the day easier for others in little ways, and a careless one spreads trouble across the floor like water. The Hobart wool scour's world is small while the shift is underway. But small worlds have depth. A crack in the tub rim becomes familiar. A beam overhead carries a stain shaped like a map. The boiler has a sound it makes when the fire draws properly, and another when it sulks. A certain board dips under the left foot. A certain corner collects lost fibers. You come to know the shed the way sailors know a deck. The outside economy may move through words such as export, shipment, auction, and price, but inside the shed the truth is more immediate. Is the water hot? Is the fleece open? Is the rack clear? Is the batch dry? Is the body still able? These questions return with the patience of rain. They make no speeches, yet they govern the day more thoroughly than any printed notice. And as noon approaches, we move with the 1880s Hobart wool scourer into the hour when hunger, heat, and damp clothing begin to speak at once. The morning's first force has faded, but the day is far from spent. Your stomach knows it, your shoulders know it, your hands know it most plainly because they have been in and out of warm, greasy, soapy water so often that the skin feels loosened from itself. A meal break, when it comes, does not transform the day, but it does make a little harbour within it. You step away from the tub and find the air cooler at once, especially where damp cloth meets the draught. Bread may be wrapped in cloth, cheese kept in a pocket or tin, tea poured dark and hot if there is water enough and a place to heat it. You eat with the practical appetite of someone who has been lifting weights since dawn. The food carries the taste of the shed no matter how carefully you wash. A faint wool smell lingers near the hands. Smoke from the fire clings to the cup. The bread may be slightly damp at the edge. Still, it is food, and the body accepts it gratefully, turning from complaint to need. You sit, if there is a place, or lean if there is not, and for a few minutes the spine feels the luxury of not bending. Conversation may rise during the pause, though quietly, because tired workers do not always spend words freely. Someone mentions weather, someone says a ship is expected, someone complains about the state of a road, the price of fuel, a foreman's temper, or a batch of wool that came in dirtier than it should have. These are ordinary complaints, not grand protests, and they pass through the room like small drafts, felt, acknowledged, and gone. You might look down at your boots while eating and see wool fibers stuck to mud along the soles. The sight is almost comic in its plainness, as though the work has decided to travel with you even across the break. A worker flicks a bit away or leaves it because another will attach soon enough. The shed marks everyone in small ways, and resisting every mark would take more energy than the day allows. Beyond the doorway, Hobart's light has strengthened, though cloud may still soften the hill and harbour. The town sounds fuller now, with carts, voices, shop doors, and the far-mixed noise of people doing their own necessary tasks. For a moment you are aware of the larger life around you, and perhaps of how little the larger life notices the scouring shed. Then the break thins, and the room begins calling you back without using your name. Returning to wet work after a pause can be harder than continuing without one. The hands have cooled, the back has stiffened, the apron feels unpleasantly clammy where it touches the body again. You take your place by the tub with a small inward reluctance, and then the old rhythm catches you, because the wool is waiting, the water is ready, and work has a way of answering reluctance with sequence. The afternoon's first batch often feels heavier than it should. Perhaps it is not heavier. Perhaps your body has become more honest. You lift, drain, shift, and set down feeling the renewed pull across the shoulders. Steam rises into your face, and the warmth that once felt like relief now feels like a hand resting too long on your chest. You continue, not heroically, but because continuation is what the day requires. The wool itself seems endless when seen from the middle of a shift. Bales that looked manageable at dawn now appear to multiply in corners, while cleaned batches occupy the racks and half-dried wool waits for attention. A worker can feel surrounded by stagers, as though every moment of the process has become visible at once. Dirty wool behind you, wet wool before you, drying wool beside you, finished wool beyond you. No direction looks empty. There is a practical comfort, though, in knowing the next step. When the mind is tired, sequence steadies it. Open the fleece, warm the water, press it gently, let it loosen. Lift and drain, rinse, spread, turn, check, gather, begin again. The order does not make the day easy, but it keeps it from becoming shapeless. And tired people often lean on order the way a hand leans on a rail. This order belongs not only to the worker, but to the material. Wool demands a path. It cannot leap from greasy fleece to clean bale without passing through heat, water, air, and handling. Each stage leaves traces of the previous one and prepares for the next. If you skip care in the first tub, the rinse suffers. If you crowd the drying rack, the packing suffers. If you pack too soon, storage suffers. The process remembers everything. And so, your attention, though quiet, must stretch forward. You are not only doing what is in your hands, you are preventing later trouble. That prevention is invisible when successful, which is one of the old frustrations of careful labor. No one remarks on the mold that did not form, the matting that did not happen, the buyer complaint that never arrived. Good work often leaves no evidence, except the absence of trouble. The body, however, keeps evidence. The hands redden, the nails soften, the shoulders grow dense with fatigue, the feet feel swollen inside boots that have taken in damp from the floor. A line of soreness develops where the apron strap lies. These marks do not need witnesses to be real. By afternoon, they have become part of your sense of the room, as constant as the boiler sound or the smell of wet fleece. A worker might try small remedies. He might rub his hands on a dry cloth before returning to the tub. He might stand straighter for a few breaths near the doorway. He might switch sides if the task allows, giving one shoulder a slight reprieve. He might tuck a sleeve differently, shift a belt, or lean a hip against the tub rim just enough to take weight from the feet. These are not comforts so much as negotiations. The shed teaches such negotiations daily. It teaches where to spend strength and where to save it. It teaches when to ask for help and when asking would take longer than doing. It teaches that a good pace is not the fastest pace, but the pace that leaves enough body for the last hour. Older workers know this especially well. They have seen young strength burn too brightly in the morning and pay for it before evening. We can imagine the older Scourer's movements becoming smaller over the years. Not weaker exactly, but more economical. He does not splash, unless splashing helps. He does not lift higher than needed. He lets water drain before carrying. He stands where the floor gives best footing. He has learned that endurance often looks like slowness to people who have never stayed through the whole day. His wisdom is written in restraint. The younger worker may learn by imitation. He watches the older hand test the wool, sees how little force is used, and notices how the batch moves cleanly without being bullied. Slowly, the lesson enters his own arms. The body copies before the mouth explains. In a trade like this, apprenticeship can happen through glances, corrections, shared weight, and the embarrassment of making a mess that everyone must step around. As afternoon grows deeper, the air changes again. The tub water is changed, but the room itself seems saturated with the history of the day. The smell of raw wool has blended with soap, smoke, wet wood, sweat, and cooling iron. It rests on the tongue. It enters cloth. It makes the world beyond the door seem unusually sharp and clean whenever the draft arrives. You do not exactly get used to it. You become part of it. There is a mild sting in the eyes sometimes from steam, smoke, or the sharpness of cleansing mixtures. You blink and keep working. A cough passes through the room, then another. Someone wipes his face with a sleeve that is not much cleaner than the skin beneath. These are ordinary acts in an ordinary day, and because they are ordinary, they rarely become stories. Yet ordinary discomfort is still discomfort, repeated until it feels like the weather. The Hobart wool scourer's job sits at a meeting point between animal softness and industrial demand. And that meeting point is not gentle for the worker. The fleece must be made clean enough for commerce, and the worker's body becomes the medium through which that change occurs. Water touches wool, but hands guide water. Heat loosens grease, but workers maintain heat. Air dries fiber, but workers spread, turn, and gather. Every natural process is assisted by labor. This is why the work can be described as a process and a job at once. Without the process, the job has no shape. Without the job, the process does not proceed reliably. The two belong together in the shed, where old knowledge, simple tools, and tired bodies cooperate with heat and water to make wool ready for another life. It is practical, repetitive, and quietly exacting. Late in the day, you may handle wool that has dried enough to be gathered. It feels changed in the hand, lighter and more open, and the fibers separate with a soft resistance instead of the greasy cling they had at dawn. You lift it from the rack, and it rises almost eagerly compared with the wet loads from earlier. The difference is a relief. It is also a reminder of how much weight water lends to labor. Dry wool floats against the skin. It catches on rough knuckles. It sends little fibers into the air when shaken, and they cling to eyelashes, sleeves, beard, or hair. The sound is nearly a whisper, a faint brushing that would be soothing if the lungs did not already know the day's air too well. You gather it carefully, because even finished softness can become disorder if handled without attention. Packing the cleaned wool takes away its loose beauty. The airy mass is compressed, folded, and made practical, because trade prefers goods that can be moved, counted, stacked, weighed, and shipped. You may see the pale fleece disappear into a denser form and feel no sadness, only the satisfaction of completion. Still, something changes when softness is forced into commerce. The open wool becomes a unit, and the day's work becomes less visible. Marks may be applied. Records may be kept. A bale may wait in the shed, then in a store, then near the wharf, each movement taking it farther from the tub where its transformation began. The wool scourer does not accompany it. He remains where the next raw fleece waits. That is the still point of his labor, not still because it lacks motion, but because everything passes through while he stays with the repeated task. And as the evening draws nearer, we follow the 1880s Hobart wool scourer into the final labors of clearing, checking, and making the shed bearable for morning. The body wants ending before the work grants it. There are tools to rinse, racks to examine, tubs to empty, scraps to gather, and wet places to make less treacherous. The last hour is rarely the easiest because maintenance has no glamour and arrives when energy is thinnest. Water emptied at day's end has a tired look. It runs thickly compared with fresh water, dulled by grease, dirt, soap, and all the small remnants drawn from fleece after fleece. It smells of work completed but not cleansed away. You watch it leave the tub, and the tub itself appears older once empty, its sides stained, its rim worn, its wood or metal carrying the evidence of many similar evenings. The container has labored too, in its own silent fashion. You rinse the tub as well as time and water allow. Cleanliness in a scouring shed is not a perfect state, but a workable one. Enough dirt removed, enough grease cleared, enough order restored. Again that word, enough, returns, the modest measure by which much working life survives. Perfection would require a different world. The shed asks for readiness, and readiness is what you try to leave behind. A paddle rinsed and set aside becomes almost restful to look at. All day it has moved through water, pressed wool, struck wood, and carried the force of your arm into the tub. Now it leans quietly, its handle dark where hands have polished it across seasons. Tools at rest have a special stillness, because they hold the memory of motion without performing it. You see them and feel your own body wishing to become equally still. The racks are checked for forgotten dampness. A clump left in shadow might sour. A fleece gathered too soon might trouble the next stage. Even at the edge of exhaustion, you look again, because experience has taught you that small neglects are patient and will wait until morning to become larger. You open one last fold, feel for coolness, and spread it wider. The movement is gentle. It costs more than it appears to cost. The floor takes longer than anyone wants. Water must be swept or pushed toward drains. Loose wool must be gathered before it clogs, rots, or creates a slipping place. Mud from boots mixes with lanolin and ash in the seams of the boards. You scrape, sweep, push, and bend, feeling how the final cleaning resembles the day's main labor in miniature. Another effort to move dirt from one place to another. The shed slowly loses its working voice. Without the constant motion of water and wool, smaller sounds become clear. A drip from a tub edge, the settling of iron as it cools. A worker's boot shifting on damp wood, the faint scrape of a basket. Outside, the town's evening life grows more distinct, as if the room has lowered its own noise enough to hear Hobart returning. The day is closing in layers. You may stand for a moment near the doorway, not quite finished, but close enough that the open air feels like a promise. The harbour breeze touches your face and carries away a little of the shed's heaviness. It smells of tide, tar, smoke, and stone after damp weather. And although those scents are not pure, they feel spacious compared with the tub. You breathe more deeply than you have all afternoon. Behind you, the workroom remains dim and damp. But now, it has a different quality. The pressure has gone out of it. No fresh bale waits open at your feet. No tub demands immediate lifting. No supervisor's glance can make water heat faster. The room is not friendly, yet it is no longer pressing forward. It is simply there, full of used warmth and the faint pale presence of wool. The worst part of such work may be how little of its difficulty can be carried into conversation afterward. If someone asks how the day was, the answer may become a shrug, a word, a small complaint about heavy wool or dirty water. To describe every sensation would take too long, and listeners might not understand why damp sleeves, repeated lifting, and a room full of steam could wear a person so thoroughly. So the truth remains mostly in the body. The body, fortunately and unfortunately, is a faithful witness. It remembers the pull of wet fleece long after the fleece is gone. It remembers the tub rim against the hip, the heat on the face, the chill at the wrists, the greasy slip of wool beneath the fingers. It remembers standing too long on damp boards. It remembers bending when it wished to straighten. Sleep must persuade all these memories to loosen. And as you leave the shed, we walk with you into the Hobart evening, where the day's labour thins but does not vanish. The street may shine with recent rain. Lamps may begin to glow in windows. Smoke rises from chimneys and drifts low when the air is heavy. Somewhere, a horse blows softly into the cool. Somewhere a door opens and warm kitchen smell escapes briefly before being shut inside again. Your boots carry damp from the yard. Your sleeves carry wool. Your hands carry the softened roughness of hot water and grease. Every step away from the shed is also a step through the day's residue. The town does not stop to notice, and that is fitting in its way, because most people moving through evening carry something similar from their own labor: flour, ash, sawdust, ink, salt, soap, sweat, or smoke. The wool scourer belongs among them, one worker among many, each person marked by a trade that may be invisible from a polite distance. A clerk may carry ink on a finger, a baker may carry flour in a cuff. A carter may carry horse smell in his coat. You carry the wool shed, and though you may wish to be rid of it, it also proves you have passed through the day and come out the other side. There is a low comfort in reaching the place where you sleep. Not luxury, Perhaps not privacy, and not the kind of rest promised in advertisements, but shelter enough to set down the body. You remove damp outer things if you can. You wash again if water is available, and patience remains. The basin clouds faintly, and the smell rises once more. Smaller now, like the shed's last whisper before night. Food in the evening tastes different from food at noon. The body is no longer preparing for more work, and hunger carries relief as well as need. You eat more slowly, if the household allows it, listening to small domestic sounds, a cup set down, fire settling, rain against a window, someone speaking in the next room. These sounds are not part of the trade, yet they receive the worker back from it. They make a human shore after the long wet crossing of the shift. The hands may ache most when still. While working, they obeyed. At rest, they complain. The fingers feel swollen. Small cuts announce themselves. The skin across the knuckles tightens as it dries near heat. You rub one thumb into the opposite palm, feeling the tender places, and perhaps you say nothing, because the day has already used enough words. Silence becomes another kind of bandage. Night in Hobart settles around working houses with a quiet unevenness. Some rooms are lively, some tired, some worried, some warm, some cold. The harbour remains nearby, even if unseen, and the hills hold darkness in broad shapes beyond the town. The wool shed stands behind you in the mind, its tubs cooling, its rack still, its floor damp and waiting. It is hard to believe a room can rest, but it can at least be unoccupied. Sleep comes not as a clean fall, but as a gradual loosening. First the larger thoughts weaken, then the day's complaints soften around the edges, then the repeated motions begin to drift apart. The tub is there, then not there. The fleece is in your hands, then it becomes a blanket, then a cloud, then nothing distinct at all. The body yields by degrees, as wool yields to water, slowly and without being forced. In that yielding, the work is not made good or easy. It is simply set down for a while. The job has taken its due, and the worker has survived another passage through heat, damp, weight, and smell. Outside, the night air cools the town, and somewhere near the water, goods wait under cover, wool among them, cleaner than it was, prepared by hands that are now finally still. The harbour breathes in the dark, patient as ever, while the last scent of lanolin fades into sleep. Before the day fully returns, there is a narrow hour when the town seems made of damp stone, low smoke, and footsteps that have not yet multiplied. The Hobart sky lightens slowly over the harbour, and the wool scour wakes with the old heaviness resting in the arms before any new fleece has been touched. You may lie still for a few moments, feeling yesterday in the hands and shoulders, while the mind understands, with no drama at all, that the tubs are waiting again. There is something almost unfair about morning after hard labour, because the world appears clean and new, while the body knows it is carrying forward what could not be repaired overnight. The air outside may feel fresh against the face, and the street may shine softly if rain has passed, but the wrists still remember heat, and the lower back remembers bending. We walk with you through that early coolness, toward the shed, where warmth will gather, where steam will rise, and where the first open bale will return the day to its familiar weight. The 1880s Hobart wool scour enters the yard as one small figure among many movements of trade, with carts being backed, ropes being handled, doors opening, and men calling in voices still rough from sleep. The wool shed does not stand apart from the town's economy, even if its work feels hidden once you are inside it. It belongs to the same morning as the wharf, the warehouse, the stable, the kitchen fire, and the shopfront shutter, all of them beginning again in their own way. A cold handle feels different in the first grasp of the morning. The paddle has not yet taken warmth from your hand, and the tub rim feels unkind against the skin. The air in the shed still has a stale dampness, as though the night closed the room but did not clear it, and the first movement of a basket stirs the faint smell of grease from the boards. You do not need anyone to explain the day. Its terms are already laid out in wood, water, wool, and smoke. The raw fleece waiting near the wall looks innocent enough in the dimness, pale and bulky, almost soft as bedding from a distance. Then you come close, and the truth returns through the fingers. The locks are clotted with yolk, the natural grease that helped protect the sheep, and there are seeds, dark flecks, dusty patches, and places where the fiber has held the memory of mud. You open it gently, because roughness now will become trouble later, and because the old work has taught you that haste often disguises itself as strength. You might think, if you were outside the trade, that dirt is simply dirt. But a wool scourer learns there are kinds of dirt, and each asks for its own patience. Some dust floats away when the fleece is shaken. Some vegetable matter clings with little hooks. Some grease loosens only after the water has warmed it through. Some stains remain stubborn even after reasonable effort, and the worker must judge when more handling would do more harm than good. This judgment is not romantic. It is practical, learned under pressure, and shaped by the knowledge that wool is valuable only if its softness survives the cleaning. The Hobart wool scourer's hands must therefore be both working hands and measuring hands, strong enough to manage soaked weight and sensitive enough to feel when fiber begins to resist in the wrong way. That dual demand is part of the job's quiet strain because the body is asked to become careful at the very moment it is being worn down. The first warm water of the morning carries a little comfort, especially before the shed has become too heavy with steam. You lower your hands and feel heat enter the joints, loosening what sleep left stiff. For a moment, the warmth seems almost kind, and the wool beneath the surface moves slowly, like something waking. Then the grease rises, the smell thickens, the water clouds, and the comforting heat becomes only another part of the labor. The tub is a patient thing, but not a forgiving one. If the water is overused, it carries dirt back where you do not want it. If the temperature falls, the work slows, and your arms must compensate. If too much wool is crowded into it, the fleece cannot open properly, and the whole batch becomes a lesson in why space matters. You learn to respect the tub not because it is complicated, but because simple things can still defeat careless hands. Around you, the room settles into its working rhythm. Someone shifts a bale, someone tests a rack. Someone clears yesterday's scraps from a corner where the broom had missed them. The boiler ticks and mutters as heat builds, and the first low thread of steam begins to blur the hard edges of the room. We remain close enough to hear the faint dragging sound of wet wool across wood, and close enough to see how slowly the morning becomes a shift. The scourer's clothes are chosen less for comfort than for survival. An apron to keep off what it can, sleeves adjusted as best they can be, boots that have learned the shape of wet boards, and layers that must answer both cold air and hot steam. No arrangement works perfectly. If you dress warmly, the shed becomes stifling. If you dress lightly, the draft finds every damp place and chills it. So the body spends the day between two discomforts, never quite dry, never quite at ease. There is a particular misery in damp cuffs. They brush the wrist again and again, cooling between tasks, warming near the tub, then cooling once more when you turn away. The sensation is small, almost too small to mention, but it becomes large through repetition. Many hard jobs are made not of one great wound, but of 100 minor irritations that return so often the mind stops naming them, and the body simply endures. As the first batch moves from wash to rinse, the wool begins to show its change. The fibers separate more freely, and the dirty heaviness gives way to something paler and more open. You lift the fleece and water pours from it in shining sheets, striking the surface below with a steady sound that fills the near space. The weight pulls down through your elbows, your shoulders answer. Your boots shift carefully on the wet floor. The rinse tub seems cleaner, and for a moment, that cleanness is pleasing. Then the water takes the stain of the work, and you are reminded that every stage receives what the previous stage has loosened. This is how processes move, by passing burden from one place to another until enough has been removed to call the material ready. You are part of that movement, not above it, and your own body receives a portion of the burden too. A wool scourer's hands grow skilled at preventing damage, but they also grow used to being damaged themselves. Hot water softens the skin, alkali or soap bites at cracks, hidden grit scratches, and the repeated gripping of wet fiber leaves tenderness in places that cannot properly rest during the shift. You may rinse your hands in cleaner water, rub them on a cloth, and return to the tub, but the relief is brief. The work reclaims them almost immediately. The shed smells gather in layers, and by mid-morning they have become almost architectural. There is the deep animal smell of unwashed fleece, the sour warmth of dirty liquor, the sharper note of cleansing mixture, the smoke from the fire, the wet timber underfoot, and the human smell of workers in heavy damp air. Together they make a kind of enclosure. You do not merely smell the room. You inhabit the smell as you inhabit the temperature. Outside, a passerby might catch a breath of it and turn away. But inside, the worker cannot afford disgust as a permanent state. Disgust takes energy. Resistance takes energy. So you adapt, and the mind places the smell in the category of the day's ordinary facts, like the tub's height or the weather. Only later, stepping into open air, do you realize how completely the shed had filled the senses, and how much of it is still clinging to you. The 1880s Hobart wool scourer works in a port town where materials are always arriving from elsewhere and leaving for somewhere beyond sight. Wool is not an idea here. It is a load on a cart, a bale in a shed, a smell in the air, a weight in the arms, a mark in an account book, and eventually a cargo moving over water. The worker stands at one point in that journey, and the point is humble enough that many people fail to see it. Yet the day's process cannot skip him. The greasy fleece must pass through warm water, through practiced handling, through rinsing, draining, drying, and gathering, and none of these acts happen by wishing. A merchant may speak of volume and demand. A buyer may speak of quality. A ship may carry the bales away. But before any of that, in the damp shed, you must lift the wool from cloudy water and make sure it is not ruined by the very cleaning meant to improve it. There is a modest intelligence in all of this, the kind found in wrists, eyes, noses, and repeated correction. You remember which batches respond well to longer soaking and which require gentler handling. You know when a tub's surface looks wrong. You know when a fleece drains too heavily, suggesting it has not opened properly. Such knowledge may never receive a formal name, but the work depends on it, as surely as a ship depends on knots tied by hands that learn them long before sunrise. And as the morning wears on, we move with the Hobart wool scour into the long middle of the shift, where the first freshness has gone and only rhythm keeps the work from becoming shapeless. The room is brighter now, though not exactly light. Steam has softened the rafters. The floor reflects pale patches from the doorway, and the clean wool on the racks seems to glow faintly against darker timber. It is beautiful for a moment, and then it needs turning. You go to the racks and test the wool that was spread earlier. Some patches have begun to lighten and lift, while thicker folds remain cool and damp within. You open them carefully, sliding fingers into the soft mass, feeling the hidden moisture against the back of the hand. Drying is deceptive work, because the surface may promise what the center refuses. The worker learns to mistrust appearances in a gentle, practical way. The air itself becomes a tool in drying, though air is never entirely under your control. Doors can be opened, windows shifted, racks arranged, and wool spread thinly, but Hobart's dampness may still slow everything. If a cool mist hangs outside, the shed cannot fully escape it. If wind rises, it may bring help or dust. If rain begins, the whole mood of the drying work changes, not dramatically, but with a low inward sigh among those who know what rain will cost. A wet day is a crowded day. Wool that should have moved along remains in place, and new work arrives before old work has left. Space tightens, paths narrow, baskets wait where they should not. Everyone must move with more care because the room has less mercy for clumsiness. You shift one batch to make room for another, but every adjustment seems to create a new inconvenience somewhere else. The wool brushes your forearms as you carry it, now lighter after washing, though still bulky enough to obscure your steps. Loose fibers cling to damp cloth. They gather at your elbows and along the apron, making you look gradually more like the material you handle. There is a quiet absurdity in it, but also a truth. Work marks the worker, and the worker, for a while, becomes part of the room's texture. You may pause to shake fiber from your sleeve, but not for long. The next load waits, the next rinse clouds. The next rack needs opening. The day does not become cruel by shouting, it becomes difficult by never ending at the moment you wish it would. Each small demand is reasonable on its own, and together they make the hours heavy. This is one reason the job's hardship can be hard to explain to anyone who sees only pieces of it. A visitor might watch for 5 minutes and see warmth, softness, water, and ordinary labor. He might not see the accumulation. He might not feel the dampness creeping into boots, the ache building in the hinge of the thumb, or the way steam turns breathing into effort after hours. He might call the work simple, and in one sense he would be right, but simple is not the opposite of hard. The lunch hour, if it can be called an hour, comes when the body has been waiting for it long enough to make food feel almost dreamlike. You step back from the tub, and the absence of motion reveals the fatigue that motion had been hiding. The shoulders descend, the hands hang, the back resists straightening. A piece of bread, a cup of tea, a small bit of cheese or meat if fortune allows, becomes the center of the world for a few quiet minutes. Food tastes of hunger first, then of smoke, salt, bread, and the faint wool smell that remains no matter how much you rub your hands. You eat with care because the stomach has been working around heat and exertion, and too much too quickly can sit heavily. Someone near you may say very little, and that is no failure of fellowship. In a hard day, shared silence can be as companionable as conversation, because everyone understands why words have thinned. If conversation does come, it is tied to the ground. Weather, wages, a foreman's mood, a ship delayed, a child unwell, a boot needing repair, a landlord mentioned with a tone that says more than the words. These are the subjects of working rest, not because imagination is absent, but because practical life presses close. The wool will not wait for philosophy, though philosophy may hide quietly inside the way a person endures the wool. You look at the drying racks while eating, because even rest is not fully free from watching. A dense place in the fleece catches your eye. A batch near the door may be drying faster than expected. A darker patch may need turning when you rise. The mind keeps little threads tied to the work, and because of that, the break is more like slackened rope than severed rope. Soon enough, it will tighten again. When you return, the first contact with the tub feels almost intimate in its unpleasant familiarity. The hand enters warm water, the fingers meet fiber, and the body remembers the whole sequence without instruction. There is no need to think in full sentences. Press, loosen, lift, drain, rinse, spread, check, begin again. The trade lives in verbs, and the verbs pull you through the afternoon. Afternoon light in the shed has a tired color. It comes through steam, dust, and the small fibers that hang in the air, making everything appear slightly softened and slightly worn. The cleaned wool is paler now, the dirty bales fewer perhaps, though never few enough, and the workers' faces carry the same sheen of heat and damp. You hear the repeated sounds with less sharpness than in the morning, as if the mind has wrapped them in cloth. The boiler's mutter becomes background, the splash of water becomes background, the scrape of baskets becomes background. Only a changed sound wakes attention, a sharper slip on the boards, a sudden knock, a bucket set down too hard, or someone's breath catching under a heavy lift. In such places, workers listen without seeming to listen because safety often depends on noticing the unusual within the ordinary. The Hobart wool scourer must be cautious with fatigue, because fatigue makes small misjudgments more likely. A batch is lifted before it has drained enough. A step is taken on a slick board. A fleece is turned too roughly. A hand goes too near water that has been heated harder than expected. None of these need become disaster to matter. Each adds pain, delay, or waste, and a long day has plenty of room for small injuries. Still, the work continues in its low, persistent way. You draw the wool through rinse water, watching the cloud fade more slowly than you would like. You press gently with both hands, then lift and let gravity work. You carry the wet mass to the board and hear it settle there with a muffled heaviness. Water runs from it in thin streams, finding old paths across the surface, as though the board has memorized where water prefers to go. A worker's relationship with gravity becomes practical and exact. Let the wool drain before carrying. Let the basket rest against the hip. Let the tub edge take some weight if it can. Let the floor help where the floor is safe. This is not laziness. It is survival by cooperation with the plain laws of the room. The body learns that every unnecessary inch of lifting must be paid for by evening. The cleaned wool, once spread, begins its slow conversation with air. Fibers separate, moisture retreats, and the color brightens by degrees, so subtle that only repeated checking makes them visible. You return to a batch after half an hour and see change where a stranger might see none. This is one of the secret pleasures of repetitive work, the ability to notice small progress. The world has moved quietly because your hands arrange the conditions for movement. There may be pride in that, but it is a private pride. It does not straighten the pay. It does not dry the cuffs. It does not repair the back. Yet it gives the day a little inner structure beyond endurance alone. A batch well cleaned is evidence that skill survived discomfort. A rack properly laid is evidence that attention held. A finished bale is evidence that the process, however humble, reached its mark. As the afternoon lengthens, we stay with that private pride without making it too bright. The job still sucked in all the ordinary ways. It was wet, tiring, poorly celebrated, and bound to conditions that workers did not choose. But it was not meaningless. Few jobs are meaningless to the people who must learn them well. Meaning may appear in the smallest reliable competence, in knowing how to do a hard thing without wasting motion. The shed's heat begins to fall unevenly when the hardest washing slows. One tub remains active, another drains, and a third stands with cloudy water waiting to be emptied. The air near the door cools first. The smell does not disappear, but it changes. Less forceful now, more stale, like the day exhaling after holding itself too long. You feel the evening approaching through the room before you see it outside. Cleaning up is its own form of repetition. Tools must be rinsed, not lovingly perhaps, but thoroughly enough that tomorrow's work does not begin in neglect. The paddle emerges from dirty water streaked and slick, and you wash it down with the same tired attention you gave the wool. The tub sides must be cleared of clinging grease and fiber. The draining boards must be scraped. Loose locks must be gathered from places where they could rot, slip, or clog. The dirty water has weight in the imagination. Even after it runs away, it contains the dissolved day, all the grease, dust, sweat, dung, traces, soap, heat, and handwork that passed through the tub. When it drains, it leaves a smell rising from the channel, and you may turn your face slightly without thinking. Old industries often made waste a quiet companion, something managed enough for the workplace to continue, but not vanished in any cleaner moral sense. You sweep the floor as well as the wetness allows. A dry broom would be useless here, so the action becomes more of a pushing, scraping, gathering motion, moving wool scraps and dirty water toward places meant to receive them. The boards shine darkly. Your boots leave prints that fill with water at the edges. The whole room seems to have been washed and soiled at the same time, which is the truth of the work. By now, speech has grown spare again. A question about where to leave something, a warning about a slippery place, a low comment about the weather if rain has begun. No one needs to say the day was long. Everyone knows it by the angle of shoulders and the careful way workers straighten after bending. The body gives the report more honestly than conversation can. The 1880s Hobart wool scourer steps through these final duties with the patience of someone who understands that tomorrow begins from tonight's condition. If a tool is misplaced, morning will suffer. If a tub is left foul, morning will suffer. If damp wool is forgotten in a dense fold, morning will suffer. In a repeating trade, the future is always being prepared by tired people at the end of the present day. There is a certain nobility in that, though the word may feel too grand for a damp shed. Tired workers still make the next morning possible. They arrange tools for hands not yet awake. They clear paths for feet not yet on the floor. They leave the room ready enough, because enough is the old promise by which working life continues. The beauty lies not in grandeur, but in maintenance. At last the room reaches its dimmer state. The tubs are not clean in any shining sense, but they are emptied. The tools are where they should be. The racks hold what must remain drying. The finished wool waits in its appointed place, quieter now that it has stopped changing under your hands. The light beyond the door has cooled toward evening, and the first breath outside feels almost like water of another kind, clear, moving, and loose around the face. You step out carefully, because the body is tired enough to resent sudden movement. The yard is damp beneath the boots. The air carries harbor salt, horse, smoke, mud, and distant cooking. all of them ordinary and generous after the closed breath of the shed. We walk beside you a little farther, not speaking over the quiet, letting the day leave slowly. The wall smell remains, but the world has widened. A worker leaving such a place may not feel triumph. More often, there is only relief, hunger, stiffness, and the practical need to get home. Yet relief is not nothing. It enters the lungs, loosens the jaw, and lets the eyes rest on distances longer than the span between tub and rack. Mount Wellington may be darkening above the town, and the harbour may hold a last dull shine, and these larger shapes remind you that the shed is not the whole world, even if it occupied the whole day. The cleaned wool remains behind, no longer animal fleece as it was in the morning, not yet cloth, not yet garment, not yet any future object someone might touch without thinking of you. It rests in between, changed by your work and ready for other hands. That in-between state is where many workers live too, between raw need and finished value, between the beginning and the profit, necessary but often unnamed. The thought may not come in such words, but the truth is there. At home, if there is warmth, it reaches you differently than the boiler's heat. It is smaller, kinder, meant for people rather than process. You may hold your hands toward it and see the reddened knuckles, the softened skin near the nails, the little lines where dirt has resisted washing. The heat draws out the ache. It also draws out the smell of the day from cloth and hair, faintly, so that even rest has a trace of the shed. Still, there is rest. A chair, a bowl, a cup, a voice, a roof. The dim relief of not having to lift anything for a while. You settle slowly because the body cannot change states as quickly as the clock does. Work has ended, but the muscles remain braced for it, and sleep must convince them, one by one, that the tub is not waiting in the next room. This persuasion may take time. The night folds itself over Hobart again, over the harbour stones, the warehouses, the damp yards, the homes of workers, and the wool shed with its cooling tubs. Inside the shed, the air grows still around the racks, and moisture continues its quiet leaving. The wool dries a little more in darkness. The tools rest without knowing they are tools. The boards hold the day's damp deep in their grain. Everything waits, and waiting is the night's work. For the scourer, sleep may come with the soft heaviness of true fatigue. The mind drifts first through ordinary thoughts, then through fragments of water and wool, then through nothing that needs a name. Your hands, which have spent all day opening, pressing, lifting, and spreading, finally unclench. The room around you grows less distinct. The harbour, the shed, the steam, the bales, the tub, and the ache all sink into one dark, quiet current, moving slowly away.